Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is the session on anti-MMT. So MMT stands for modern monetary theory. It's very famous. It's well known. It's sort of like the brand new thing in macroeconomics and discussions in public finance. The left particularly likes it because it provides a lot of justifications or rationale for expanded government spending, lots and lots of government expropriation of privately owned resources. So I think that the Austrian school is especially suited to critique this new strain of thought, especially the newer authors that are popping up. And so the plan is to collect the contributions, the presentations that will happen here into a book, as well as a couple others. A book that will be published by the Mises Institute. It'll be the target audience will be not just academics, but also intelligent laymen, so that, especially since MMT is such a popular new ideology, we want anybody to be able to pick it up and see what the Austrian school has to say about it. So the order of our speakers will be, as you see on the slide here, and for our presenters, I've got it up here so you know who's coming after you. I'll start off by talking about my particular contribution to this book. So I'll be talking about the origins of money. This is something that's central to the MMT set of ideas. They hold to chartalism, so they say that money is a creature of the state, and that the way that the state is able to get people to accept the money is primarily through taxation. So they say that the state can just decide that some token, some good, can be used as money, and then they'll say, you have to bring it back to us or else, right? Which is just taxation. And so this stirs up demand for the money, and that's how they say that money originates. Of course, this is in direct contrast to what Austrian economics has to say about the origins of money. So going back to Karl Menger, he explained, using what I consider to be incontrovertible theory, that money originates out of barter, out of the issues, difficulties in trying to get the thing that you want for direct use out of a barter sort of system. So if you're coming to market with one particular item, you have this plan, you have this idea of the thing that you want for direct use, you have to overcome this double coincidence of wants problem. You have to find somebody who wants what you have, and you have to want what they have. And so you can imagine that this would be very difficult to achieve. So Menger points out that market participants would notice that some goods are more saleable, some goods are more marketable than others. And if they notice that, and if they act to use certain goods, certain more saleable goods, they demanded in exchange, so they acquired in exchange not for their own direct use, but with the intention to use it in a second transaction so that they could get what they actually want. Then they've used that good, that more saleable good, as a medium of exchange. And then that sort of gets a snowball rolling, so to speak, where as people notice this, more people start to demand certain goods to be used in this way, which actually increases the salableness of those goods until we get to a point where virtually all transactions are denominated or have on one side of the transaction a particular medium of exchange. Therefore, we have money. So this is straightforward, uncontroversial, right? Especially in this room, very uncontroversial. But the MMTers hate it. They do not like this idea. They explicitly call up Menger. And what they say mainly is that there's all of these historical cases where states have gotten involved in money. So look, this state got involved in money. Menger's wrong. That's the sort of idea. So they don't really have much of a theory to back up their story of the origins of money. They just sort of point to these particular historical cases. But just to clarify, show you that it really is central to their point of view. In the Modern Money Theory Elgar companion book, Simonova says this: because money is a creature of the state, its supply is potentially unlimited, which has important implications for the conduct of fiscal policy by the state. As the monopoly issuer of money, a sovereign state can create as much money as necessary to achieve full employment and a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. Contrary to the medalist, that's what they're referring to as the Mengerian view, medalist rhetoric, a sovereign state does not have to rely on taxation and borrowing in order to spend. The purpose of taxation is simply to create demand for the government's money. So one more theoretical point that I'll make before I dive into the historical case study that they point to is that legal compulsion cannot explain the origin of a money. One very important reason is that you need a history of prices. You need some way to establish the purchasing power of money in order for people to start using it as money. And so if a king drops a bunch of pieces of paper in the center of town and says, "This is our new money," or something like that, there's no way for people to reckon, calculate, think about how many of these pieces of paper should I grab? How many should I then use in exchanges? So that you need this history of prices, this an expectation of what people might accept. How many units of this piece of paper will people accept in the future? So that's one major flaw, one theoretical hole in the chartalist view. But also, even if we grant the idea that a king could stir up demand for these things, these pieces of paper, by saying we're going to put you in jail if you don't bring a certain number back. So we're going to tax this thing. It seems that the Mengerian story, the Mengerian theory still holds as to how that thing would then become money. So sort of grant them the price formation process. We'll just set that aside. But even in order for those pieces of paper to become money, it would have to be that market participants recognize that they're more saleable, that they start to use them in exchanges, right? So there's no prescription on the part of the Mengerian view that people have to demand the thing for a non-monetary use, like making jewelry, right? There's no particular prescription about how or why people are valuing this good for non-monetary uses. And so it's perfectly fine with the Mengerian story to say that people might demand this thing because it's a get out of jail free card, right? So it's that the Mengerian view it encompasses even that particular motivation that the chartalists point to. Okay, so what? Forgot to put this up here. There's just a comparison of the two views, but I think I've covered all of the main points here. So what historical case do they like to point to? And I tried to find the oldest one. What point in history are they going back the furthest? And the answer is these clay shoe body tablets, the ancient Mesopotamia. They're chiseling using cuneiform letters, cuneiform figures, and most of them are receipts. Most of them are just documenting this person received this many units of silver, this many units of grain, so on and so forth, all these different transactions that were occurring. Of course, since this was at the onset of writing itself, most of the people who were doing the writing were temple administrators, state administrators, right? Because they were the ones who had the tools and had the job description from the state to do that sort of thing. So much of the tablets do indicate dealings with the state, but not all of them. And so they point to these tablets as this was the first fiat money. This is where money came from. And I noticed in Ray's 1998 paper, he talks about these tablets, as you can see there, but he doesn't cite any sources except for Innis. And so I looked at where he cited Innis, and notice there's no sources cited. So they might have done some research. They might have had some book that they were looking at about these tablets. They'd have to become aware of them somehow. But I thought that was a little suspicious, and so I decided to do the research myself, which led me to a few weeks of just doing a deep dive on ancient Mesopotamian history, and it was quite thrilling. It was a lot of fun, actually, to read about this. But what I noticed when I was going through what historians of this period were saying, what archaeologists were finding, is that silver was used as money in this time period, in this area. In the ancient Near East, they were using silver as money. And this is documented in many of the tablets that they're referring to, that they said that the tablets were used as money, but the tablets themselves are indicating that people were using silver as money. So Menger didn't point to a particular time period. Christopher Hansen has a good article where he makes the case that Menger was constructing something that was like economic law, something that's time invariant, universal. So he wasn't referring to a specific history. And so since the MMTers have pointed to this history, I've decided to follow up on it. So just to give you an idea of what's on these tablets, I looked at some translations, and so this is from Nies is the name of the author, Nies. What's that? No, it's Nies. Yeah. Payment in silver of temple singers, which he interpreted as payment as money paid as hire. Someone borrowed 120 shekels of silver with an interest rate of 20%. Someone received a precise weight of silver in a spot exchange, 60 and 2/3 shekels and 20 grains of silver on the 13th day of the month. That's a direct translation of the tablet. Someone with the position of money lender. Soldiers were paid in money, not in kind. That's a direct quote. The literal translation of the word for paymaster is one who cuts up money. And finally, in the back of the book, when he's going through the index of words and phrases, under the heading for shekel, the translator comments that the pictograph probably represents an implement for cutting metals such as gold, silver, and copper to be used as money. So very interesting. And this is all happening, in the end of the 3rd millennium BC to early 2nd millennium BC, as you can see. And I pointed out a few areas where they've collected these what's called hack silver hoards. So you might wonder if they were using silver as money, but this was thousands of years before coinage. What did the silver look like? How were they doing this? And the answer is that they were cutting it up. They were breaking off little pieces of jewelry or like a cup or something like that. And one thing that they've done in the literature, the archaeologists have examined the weights of these items. And they've noticed that it matches the pieces of silver in these hack silver hoards that somebody would put under their floor. It matches the weights of the balance weights in their measuring system. So it's not just like they were setting aside this one particular good, but you could tell that they were trying to achieve particular weights of the silver by cutting them off. Very interestingly, one of the authors was examining the hoards that were in the Cisjordan area, and she noticed that one of the very common types of hack silver that was in those hoards was chocolate bar ingots. So it's like this long piece of silver, and it's just like it sounds. It's like a chocolate bar where there's like a raised section and then a narrower section so that you could easily break it off. And you could tell that they were equally portioned so to achieve a particular weight or particular size of silver. So it's just fascinating stuff. One extra piece of evidence that this author that was examining those silver hoards found was the existence of a counterfeit silver chocolate bar. She says the ubiquity of chocolate bar ingots might render them banal were it not for one outstanding specimen from a 12th century hoard uncovered at Beth Shean. It's a single chocolate bar portion. The surface of the ingot is completely silver in appearance, but the cross-sectioning of the object for laboratory analyses revealed a hidden copper core. The presence of the core supports the idea that the object was not simply a piece of scrap destined for the melting pot. The ingot was to be valued for its purity of its composition, that is to say, what its weight in silver could afford. It is the earliest counterfeit silver currency presently known. So there's, here's a picture of some of the hack silver hoards that have been found. Broad consensus among archaeologists of this period and historians of this period that are looking at the texts, looking at what can be dug out of the ground, and they all indicate that silver was used as money. Moreover, the tablets were not exchanged at all. I found many references where they were saying that these tablets that the MMTers are talking about were not exchanged. They were not money, but silver was. On this, so if we saw an impressionist tablet, or impressionist slide the other day, here's an impressionist view of some of the references that are cited in these papers. There's just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of papers analyzing all of the hoards of silver from this period, what's indicated on the tablets, and it seems to me that this vindicates Menger's view and just totally smashes the MMT view. One last thing that I'll say is that the MMTers will sometimes, create an escape route for themselves. They'll say, even if we're wrong about the origins of money, this is modern monetary theory, and so what really matters is what might be what might we learn from history that will help us, understand the nature of modern money. And so I think that it's more important to them than they're letting on. Maybe it's because they know that they're wrong about the origins of money. And so I say in my conclusion that what the history of money shows is that over millennia, states co-opted and monopolized this market institution for their own ends. Ray sarcastically described this view this way. He says, all would have been fine and dandy, except that evil governments came along, monopolizing the mints, creating central banks that debased the currency, and interfering with the invisible hand of the market. This finally resulted in abandonment of commodity money, substitution of a fiat money, and central bank-induced inflation, to which I say, yeah, you're right. So he's sarcastically describing this, but I think this is the implication for the whole MMT project. The rest of it just sort of falls apart. Okay, so thank you very much. Next up is Joshua Mawhorter.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Are you keeping track of the time? Or? Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so my paper, I'm going to read the abstract in a second, but I have kind of a salty title toward MMT. It's called Check Your Privilege, MMT's Privileged Position and Economic Destructionism. And I want to just read a bit of my abstract here before I go over some of the main points. But my central point is basically MMT is embedded in this rich country perspective that they're borrowing conditions from the United States to basically develop economic thinking. They just think they've discovered something new, but they don't realize that they're standing on top of presuppositions or assumptions that MMT would undermine and totally destroy. It's kind of like there's this comic of a guy sitting on a branch talking about how he doesn't need the branch in the tree and he's sawing it off, but he doesn't realize that once he does that, he's going to collapse, he's going to fall down. But anyway, let me read my abstract here and kind of go over some of the main points. It says, proponents of modern monetary theory, MMT, claim that only monetary sovereigns may employ their policy positions, a status enjoyed by few countries. However, the only way for countries to achieve this status is after a sustained period of economic growth, limited government, capital formation, and sound money, all of which are anathema to MMT. So basically, how you become a monetary sovereign is doing the opposite of MMT for a long time, and then you can have a brief unspecified period of MMT that will collapse the system eventually if continue. So it goes on here to say, some opponents arguing from the left say that MMT exhibits an unacknowledged privilege that is embedded in a rich country perspective. While not sufficient to refute MMT completely, there is an element of truth to this. This privilege involves certain assumptions which take for granted conditions that either would not exist or could not continue if MMT were implemented. Historical evidence shows that the few countries in which MMT might apply have not followed MMT policy prescriptions, especially in the United States, which is MMT's monetary sovereign par excellence. So the US is MMT's favorite example of where they think they can prove MMT might be possible, but it's also the most powerful counterexample because the US has not employed MMT to become a monetary sovereign. It's followed a course of a freer market, more sound money, capital formation, all the things MMT hates and wants to get rid of. The US has done those things to become a monetary sovereign. This inadvertent sabotage of the presupposed foundations is likened to that of the socialists of the 20th century in the calculation debate. The socialists similarly assumed dispersed knowledge, so Hayek's knowledge problem, and the preconditions of economic calculation, Mises's calculation problem. And they also assumed an already developed capital structure MMT unknowingly assumes each of these critical aspects of the economy, yet would undermine them if implemented. So they basically assume the preconditions of economic calculation. They suppose that they have the ability to centrally plan an economy, which would run into not only the calculation problem, but the knowledge problem. And they assume, like most people benefiting from a capital structure in a wealthy country like the United States, they don't know about really capital theory, so they don't understand where that came from, where the prosperity of the United States came from. And so they just assume that it would always kind of constantly be there. And I kind of, in, again, a kind of more sarcastic way, this isn't here, but it's a good example. I kind of compare MMT to bratty rich kids who don't know that they're rich, and they decide to kind of kick their parents out and say, you know what, I can run this household better than you can. But then for a few weeks, it's fine. But then when they realize they're running out of groceries, they don't know how to pay their electric bill, the water bill, reality catches up with them. That's kind of like the MMT prescriptions saying, oh, well, the US, has no reason to be limited fiscally. We can use inflation to reach full employment. We can do all these things. They're overlooking the knowledge problem, the calculation problem, and the development of the capital structure. Let me talk a little bit about MMT in the United States. So the United States is MMT's favorite example of a monetary sovereign. So MMT, they don't actually just say that, hey, inflation can just work everywhere. You can just inflate. They recognize there are problems like Zimbabwe or other countries that have inflated their currency system to death and collapsed it. But they say there's a few countries that are monetarily sovereign. And so their focus is on particularly the United States, that the United States, it has its debt denominated in dollars. So when it prints money, it doesn't owe the money to somebody in the direct sense that we typically associate with like private debt. And so they use the U.S., but I'm arguing that the U.S. is actually their worst example for their own theory. And because that runs into basically the problem of monetary sovereignty versus chartalism. Chartalism, as Dr. Newman just explained, is this kind of state theory of money where the state creates the money and gives it exchange value through taxation. But the problem is that's easier to do when looking back 3,000 years into ancient Mesopotamia. But we know the monetary history of the United States, and it doesn't match chartalism. The United States has had things from the beginning with different types of standards of money, tobacco, iron nails, wampum beads, gold, and silver. But we can look into the monetary history of the United States and see chartalism did not take place here. So now MMT is in a point of contradiction in 2 points of their theory. The US is their best example of a monetary sovereign, but if chartalism is so central to MMT and so foundational, chartalism did not take place in the United States. So MMT, in my opinion, has to choose. It has to either say the US is our best example, or it has to abandon chartalism, because it can't have both of those things consistently. So that's the first point on just kind of that monetary sovereignty versus chartalism in the United States. The other focuses of the paper are on MMT and its capital theory, meaning it takes for granted what it takes to develop a complex capital structure, and the fact that by ceasing to maintain that, or by doing things that undermine capital production, or maintaining the capital structure, you can very easily regress into economic destructionism, as Mises called that. And so what MMT basically doesn't, the other Dr. Newman will talk about the structure of production in MMT, but I'm basically arguing that it's part of MMT's privilege position that they basically assume that the capital structure will always be there without having to be developed or maintained, or that without this can be done without more private saving and investment and all these things. They think that it will just be the case continually. And so I'll read a quote from Rothbard just regarding the importance of capital theory, and then just realizing MMT assumes that this will just automatically be the case, which actually lots of economists, non-Austrian economists, assume that as well. Rothbard says in Man, Economy, and State, he says, the fact that such shifts from saving to consumption, and he's talking about capital consumption, can and do happen, serve to refute easily the fashionable assumption that our capital structure is by some magical provision or hidden hand permanently and eternally self-reproducing once it is built. No positive acts of saving by capitalists are deemed necessary to maintain it. And so basically I'm arguing that MMT's privilege is assuming that the capital structure will continue to be there, and that their policy prescriptions will continue to eat away at the capital structure. The other parts of my paper deal with MMT's not only capital structure, but with the calculation problem, like the socialists dealt with regarding Mises, and the knowledge problem with Hayek. The calculation problem, Mises, Rothbard, others have pointed out that the issue of that as government gets more involved through its interventions in the economy, it creates these islands of calculational chaos. And so MMT thinks it can be done very cleanly through just, we'll just print money to move the economy to full employment. But if it gets, price inflation gets too hot, we'll just take out the money through taxation. And what they're totally overlooking, that they don't even know that they need to be looking for, is the effects of disrupting economic calculation and creating, as Rothbard called it, calculational chaos. They're also overlooking the knowledge problem that by following these prescriptions of their policies, this can, I think, best be seen in politicians like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who says, she points out some things, to be fair, like, why are we spending money on these wasteful projects? We don't seem to have enough money, when it's for these projects, but not for these projects. Why are we able to spend on these wars, but not able to spend on healthcare? And the Austrians would say, well, you're inflating or you spending at a deficit, and that causes economic disruption no matter what you spend it on. So we're being consistent there. But she's basically doing kind of the same thing. She's saying, look, politicians make these decisions on the behalf of the public that aren't beneficial to the public and the public's wants. Well, what do she and MMTers want to replace it with? Politicians making decisions, replacing the subjective preferences of individuals with what politicians want. But what Hayek pointed out in the knowledge problem is that not only is knowledge dispersed, but it's not just factual informational data, but it's subjective preferences of individuals. So as politicians make those decisions, or bureaucrats make those decisions, they are replacing individual preferences with the subjective preferences of politicians. I call that do as I say, not as you do. That's kind of the MMT model. So they get upset when it's the preferences of other politicians for other programs, but they want to replace it effectively with the same thing, which I argue is basically their privileged position. So in conclusion, I'll wrap up here, that basically the thing to keep in mind is that the US is a terrible example for proving MMT. It's actually a very powerful counterexample. And then the MMTers assume certain things will always be there. They assume the capital structure of the United States, which was formed largely by a freer market and sounder money, which has been undermined over time. They assume the availability, the possibility of economic calculation, which they don't even know really to look for that problem. And they assume the ability of knowledge to centrally plan an economy, all of which under MMT would undermine it. And that's part of their privilege. So anyway, thank you. I'll pass it to Dr. Salerno.
My talk, or the paper that I'm writing, takes a history of thought perspective on MMT. I address the question of how did we get to MMT? And my answer is that we get to MMT through the quantity theory. That the quantity theory in its early versions and in the version by Irving Fisher perpetrated an illusion, what I call the spending illusion. Now, the delicious irony here is that Irving Fisher and all economists today, they reveled in criticizing the public for being subject to money illusion. That is, that when money prices and money wages changed, that it always indicated a change in the real economy, even if there were inflation or deflation. But it was really Irving Fisher who perpetrated the spending illusion, what I refer to as the spending illusion, was the most influential perpetrator. There were others before him, other quantity theorists, which I'll talk about. So what I'll quickly do is just show you the basic outline of the paper. And I won't probably get to all of these points, but I'll highlight some of the important points that are in the paper, and that will lead you to the conclusion. I probably will not get to explain how the modern monetary theory is connected to the quantity theory. But what is a spending illusion? Well, the spending illusion is a causal factor in the determining the purchasing power of money and other economic quantities. Or spending is. That is the illusion, that it's really spending, this cascade of money coming into the economy that establishes money prices. Real prices, relative prices, are established separately in the real part of the economy. But to get the actual money prices, you need this cascade of spending. Let's take, for example, Milton Friedman. He says, the only cure for inflation is to reduce the rate at which total spending is growing. I mean, that is the key insight of the quantity theory. Stephanie Kelton, the mother, or let's call her the grandmother of the MMT, writes, it's not the printing of money per se, but the spending of money that matters. The economists behind MMT recognize that there are real limits to spending, and attempting to push beyond these limits can manifest in inflation. There's not much difference between her and Friedman on this point, except that Friedman believes that there are some effects on, when you increase the money supply, there are some effects on real variables, but they're very short term. Whereas Kelton and her ilk believe that, well, the economy tends to be always with idle resources, and therefore it'll last long. You can pump money into the economy much longer than you would be able to, or much more rapidly than you would be able to, according to Friedman. So let me expose the spending illusion. It was summed up and exposed in a great book by William H. Hutt in 1963. And he went back and in 1972 in his book Rehabilitation of Say's Law and made it even clearer. So let's read this, because this is very important. He says, I've come to see that the general rate of expenditure, the movement of money, is a consequence of the value of the money unit and not its cause. Expenditures do not determine prices. Prices determine expenditures. Spending is incidental. If prices in general rise, an increased number of money units must be offered for any quantum of non-money. Each price established represents what must be spent if a good is to be sold and purchased. The increased spending is, then, a consequence, not a cause. It is the valuing process, not the spending, which follows the valuing, that determines prices. And if you think of how Mises talks about changes in purchasing power, Mises always says that an increase in the money supply will cause a fall in the marginal utility of money. And his next step is that people will then be prepared to pay higher prices on the market. He says that again and again in Theory of Money and Credit and in Human Action. There's no talk of spending. So when people are prepared to spend higher prices on the market, the demand goes up, and with given supplies, prices are established, and then the spending occurs. So Austrians completely reject or don't fall victim to the spending illusion. And the classical economists did not fall victim to the spending illusion. James Mill wrote in 1808, "The true idea of money is neither more nor less than that of a commodity which is bought and sold like other commodities." Now, though Mises rejected classical value theory, he accepted this view of money as, as a commodity among commodities. This is Mises' writing. He's referring back to a German economist with classical roots, Roscher, and also partly an historical economist. Roscher's often quoted remark that the wrong definitions of money can be divided into two main groups: those which think of it as more and those which think of it as less than the most saleable good, applies not only to the definition of money. Even a number of those who consider the theory of money a part of catalactics go too far in emphasizing its special position. Money is not special when it comes to value theory. Money is part of value theory, not classical value theory, but in Mises' case, marginal utility theory. Let's look at the neoclassical view of money. These are the two earliest and most before Fisher, most influential quantity theorists, one American, one British. Francis Amasa Walker, who was the most influential quantity theorist up until Fisher, wrote that the need for money arises solely out of the fact of exchange. There's exchange out there, and so you need money to facilitate it. Conceivably, money might be an article which held no appreciable cost of production, but naturally limited in quantity, or it might be an article owing its use to authority or to convention. So money is a counter. Money is something that facilitates exchanges. It's not valued in itself. J. Shield Nicholson, the British economist, says something similar. He says, "Money we may suppose to consist of counters of a certain size made of the bones of the dodo, and is to be regarded as of no use except to effect exchanges." Okay, so this is a model that he's setting out. Now, classical monetary theory explained the purchasing power of money by using value theory. And so John Stuart Mill wrote, "Money is a commodity, and its value is determined, like that of other commodities, temporarily by supply and demand." Okay, not the quantity theory, supply and demand, which is really different. "Permanently and on the average by the cost of production." Okay, now that obviously part of that is wrong, but it's embedded in value theory, which is important. Nassau Sr. was even more emphatic. In fact, he thought Mill did wander off and make the supply and demand into the quantity theory later on. But Nassau Sr. emphasized the value of money does not depend permanently on the quantity of it possessed by a given community, or on the rapidity of its circulation, velocity of circulation, or on the prevalence of exchanges, or on the use of barter or credit, or in short, on any cause whatever excepting the cost of its production. We as Austrians would add, accepting the marginal utility of money. So it's a part of the economy. On the other hand, and this was summed up very well by a neglected historian of thought who's very good on classical monetary theory, Willie Mason. He wrote, "The organic unity of classical theory, which Mises pointed to and Mises liked, is explained by the fact that money was a commodity whose value was accounted for in the same manner as anything else. Monetary theory was an integral part of classical value theory. Let's look at neoclassical value theory. What does Walker say about it? He says the demand for money refers not merely to the amount of goods produced, but also to the frequency with which those goods were to be exchanged in their passage from producer to consumer, the velocity of circulation of goods. The supply of money refers not alone to the number of money pieces. It wasn't gold, it didn't have to be anything, it was just a counter. But also, and conjointly with this, to the rapidity of their circulation. The demand for money and the supply of money are therefore both quantities of two dimensions. In other words, both the goods and money are two flows that are meeting one another in a spending process. And they are the number of units of goods or money times their respective velocities of circulation. Okay. Prices are determined by the amount of goods offered for money and the amount of money offered for goods. No talk about value. Thank you. Same thing with J. Shield Nicholson. And this is his little model in which he tries to show that this is the main cause of the value of money. He agrees that it's not realistic, but he says it does shed light on the cause. Let it be assumed that there are 10 traders, each with one kind of commodity and no money, and one trader with money, 100 pieces, and no commodities. Further, let this moneyed man place an equal estimation on all the commodities. Then all the money will be offered against all the goods, and every article being assumed of equal value, the general level of prices will be 10. I mean, just the spending. If the amount of money has been 1,000 pieces, the general level would have been 100 pieces per article. And if only 10 pieces, the price per article would have been only 1. So just to sum up, I do have time to just mention, the modern monetary theory is the ultimate spending illusion. Taxing and spending drive demand, supply, and the purchasing power of money. So they first say money is not a thing, but a unit of account in which we keep track of all debits and credits. It is purely abstract and representational. Money of account is the measure. Medium of exchange is the thing measured. Medium of exchange is not even money. It's just measured by this sort of numeraire. So here's how money gets into the economy. A government first creates a unit of account. It comes up and says, well, the dollar is a unit of account now. And then imposes tax obligations in the national money of account. This is sufficient to ensure that many, indeed most debts, assets, and prices will also be denominated in the national money of account. In other words, just by announcing the dollar as a money of account, people will start using it without any exchange going on, without any valuing. The government is then only then is it able to issue a currency that is also denominated in the same money of account, so long as it accepts that currency in tax payment. And lastly, so after it imposes and enforces the tax liabilities, it ensures that at least those subject to taxes will want the domestic currency. So it's spending, it's the spending that really drives the demand for money, the fact that you can spend it on taxes. In the developed nations, the population is willing to accept more domestic currency than is needed for tax payments. The normal case is that anything for sale domestically is not for sale in the domestic currency, or it is for sale in domestic currency. I can't really go much further than this, but basically it's the same thing as a quantity theory. The amount of money that you create for tax liabilities, then is people begin to accept it in secondary exchanges, and the value of money is caused by the spending of this money, whose value in some sense, in a gross sense, is given by the amount of tax liabilities, the underlying value. So obviously it'll be much more, I'll elaborate much more on these points in the paper. But I just think it's very interesting that the quantity theory this is the stepchild, or as Joan Robinson might say, the bastard child of the quantity theory, the MMT. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to talk about this. These are not scare quotes, by the way. Oh, thanks. This this is an actual quote, as I'll show you. It's the tentative title of my chapter. Coming up with the money is the easy part. MMT and Entrepreneurship. And I've done something similar before in a book edited by Steve Cates, the famous anti-Keynesian, where I wrote a chapter on what are the implications of recognizing entrepreneurship when you're reading Keynesian economics. And of course, the conclusion there is that, well, there's no entrepreneurship. And adding entrepreneurship to the picture really flips the logic on its head. So I was going to do the same thing now for this chapter. So when Dr. Newman, one of them, invited me to write it, obviously I wanted to do the same sort of thing for MMT. The issue here, though, is that Keynesians tend to at least talk somewhat about the economy. MMTers don't. So they pretend to, and they tend to claim that they do, but there's not really anything but statistical aggregates, if even that. So I was scanning through their writings and also their speeches and so forth to try to figure out what are they actually saying about entrepreneurship. I sort of expanded it beyond entrepreneurship to just ask, what the hell do they mean about the real economy in general? And that too is sort of it's a deafening silence. But I'm going to focus in this presentation on the entrepreneurship of it, of course. So looking through some of their writings and the literature that they have published, an obvious starting point is the textbook by Mitchell, Ray, and Watts, in which it's used to teach macroeconomics, and we can discuss whether macroeconomics is actual economics, but it is at least taught at most universities. So of course there are professors using this, and searching through this textbook on macroeconomics for just the term entrepreneur or any variation of it, there are 3 hits in total, and you probably can't see that here, but of those 3 hits, 2 of them are from quotes from other sources. And 1 just mentions it. They could put any sort of generic term for business or whatever in there. It doesn't actually have any meaning. So it's safe to say that in terms of their macroeconomics, there's no mention of the entrepreneur or even entrepreneurship in terms of, say, small business startups or job creation through businesses and that sort of thing, as most economists would talk about. It's simply absent from their discussion. Of course, they talk about employment and things like that, but where do those jobs come from? If you're talking about the employment statistic, it doesn't really matter if it's productive efforts in a business or if it's just government jobs. As in, for instance, the job guarantee, which seems to be a core component of the policy recommendations in the MMT camp. Okay, so let's do another book, the Elgar Companion. The same thing there, searching for the term entrepreneur, gives you, in this case, it's a longer book, a total of 4 hits. But the same thing here, that those uses of the term don't actually mean anything. And they tend to be just generic mentions, but there's no reasoning about entrepreneurship or what entrepreneurs might do or where they come from or how do we get more of it. I mean, even politicians on Capitol Hill will talk about how important it is to support entrepreneurship, whatever that means. But at least they would mention it, right, and have some sort of conception about it. So none of that, which I suppose is fine in a macro textbook, but yeah, whatever. So what do they actually say then about entrepreneurship? Well, in this modern day and age, of course, who do you ask? Well, AI, right? So I did that too, just to get sort of an overview and make sure that I capture a lot of different views online in general of what do MMTers, whether it's a blog post or a book or whatever, what do they say about entrepreneurship? So here is Microsoft's Copilot, which is ChatGPT, but combined with Bing. And I asked, what does MMT say about entrepreneurship in the economy? Because I didn't want just the AI to spit out that, oh, these are the mentions of the term, but also what is the entrepreneur in the economy? What do they actually do? And you can see here that it doesn't focus extensively on entrepreneurship, Copilot says. It's not a standalone topic in the MMT doctrine, but it is implied, and well, that's a generous way of putting it, in these 4 points which are sort of discussed in MMT. One is public investment and innovation. That's very, very broad. It's not really entrepreneurship theory, let's put it that way. In access to credit, and also the job guarantee programs, there you go, and demand-driven growth, which of course is what, as Dr. Salerno showed a minute ago, is just the opposite, right? But they tend to like those positions. So that doesn't help us a whole lot. So I asked another AI, one that at least according to some people is less tainted, politically speaking, so Grok on X or Twitter. So I asked the exact same question, and Grok says it doesn't really have a specific detailed stance on entrepreneurship as a standalone concept. Okay, so the AIs agree there. But it provides a broader framework for understanding how economies function. Oh, okay, that's interesting. And that can be applied to entrepreneurship. So it focuses on the role of government, the spending and taxation and so forth. All right, sure. And it says, in short, just like Copilot had a bunch of points on different macro aggregates that are supposedly relevant for entrepreneurship. But then it summarizes, and it says, in short, MMT suggests entrepreneurship thrives when government uses its currency issuing power to ensure demand, resources, and stability, rather than leaving it entirely to private markets, which is kind of odd because you'd think that entrepreneurs are in private markets. So it's less about entrepreneurship itself and more about creating conditions where it can flourish, which isn't that far out because very often we talk about the institutional framework within which you might have more or less entrepreneurship. But of course, you don't get more details than this. So the question then is, okay, where do I look for this? It's not in the books and it's not online according to AI. Well, so you can ask, of course, an authority. And my dear friend, Stephanie Kelton, is one such authority. And this is a couple of quotes where she sort of addresses entrepreneurship. One is, and then you can see that it is an actual quote, coming up with the money is the easy part. The real challenge lies in managing your available resources so that inflation does not accelerate. Okay, we need to manage our available resources. That seems not very focused on the microeconomy at all, or action or entrepreneurship at all. And then she says in a TED Talk, which I recommend, by the way, because it's very not insightful, but it's illuminating of their worldview, in which she says that Uncle Sam's red ink is our black ink. His deficit is our financial surplus. Just follow the money. It's a good idea, by the way, but $100 goes into our bucket, $90 goes back out to pay taxes, $10 is left in our bucket. So that's how we make money. The government spends money into the economy, and then it takes some back in taxation, and whatever is left over, they say, yeah, profit. And she has a statement somewhere that were it not for government spending, entrepreneurs could not earn profits. Which is a very interesting concept for me as an entrepreneurship scholar. What does profit mean? Well, it necessarily means government currency. So you can't get your hands on the government currency, but that's not really what profit means, right? If you have profit also in a barter economy, and you trade because both parties expect to be better off, so both parties gain and earn a profit, but there's no government currency. How could that be? So it's insightful into their worldview, which focuses only on sort of the Federal Reserve building and the headquarters of the Treasury, and that's the economy. There's not a whole lot more going on. So There's also I also want to share a tweet by Stephanie Kelton, where she says that many people don't realize this, and that's probably true, but that's also actually a good thing. But government deficits are both a source of corporate profits, there you go, and the mirror image of a financial surplus in the non-government sector. And I'm showing you this not because it's very insightful into the economy, but also because their analysis is all about the two sectors of the economy. It's not about the actual economy, what we would consider the economy, but it is the government and the private sector. And profits is that the private sector has more bits of currency than they had before. So, therefore, she points out the problem is not the money or the currency, but it is the resourcing of the government projects. So the private sector is merely a well or a spring of resources that can be used for public goods through the government. Which of course completely excludes entrepreneurship unless you think of entrepreneurship as that magical power that creates resources that the government can use. Which is, it sort of undermines the whole concept of economy in terms of economizing, right? Because it's just grab the resources and that's it. So this is what I found about entrepreneurship in MMT, which is not a whole lot. So maybe I'm thinking of just submitting a blank page to Dr. Newman, have the title, maybe a short bio, and then this is it, right? Blank. Just like a trade agreement should look like, right? But why does this matter? Well, it matters because the economy is entrepreneurship and everything that happens as a result of it, right? So we can look at a couple of comments from 1.5 Austrians. So Mises in Human Action, it says that the driving force of the market process is provided neither by the consumers, so it's not demand driven, nor by the owners of the means of production, land, capital, goods, and labor, but by the promoting and speculating entrepreneurs. It's entrepreneurs that push towards producing things that they hope will be of value to consumers, and then the satisfied want is, well, that's the economy, trying to get to that point, right? Schumpeter, the half Austrian, is more to the point, really, in what I want to say here. He says that now a theoretical construction, so any kind of theory, tradition, or body of theory, which neglects this essential element of the case, which is the entrepreneurship or innovation, neglects all that is most typically capitalist about it, that is the market system. So you can't really have a discussion about the market system, aka the economy, without entrepreneurship. You just simply cannot understand it. So even this, of course, addresses mainstreamers as well, and their the gang sign, supply and demand graphs. And Schumpeter says, even if correct in logic, which is not the case perhaps for MMT, as well as in fact, it's like Hamlet without the Danish prince. You don't have the main actor, the main character in the economy, so how can you then explain the economy? And I think what MMTers do, what a lot of macroeconomists do, is that they start with the effect of, and they assume that that is the cause. And then, of course, they assume that these aggregates have constant relationships, and they just deal with that, and the government can step in and flip things back and forth and create whatever outcome you want. But we still lack that ultimate cause in the economy for production and so forth. Where the hell do the resources come from? Resources being not only virgin land, but all the capital that is out there as well, all the production processes, the production facilities and things like that, which are just assumed by MMTers to exist. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hi everyone, it's me again. So I'm here. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So, in case you didn't get enough of the Newmans, you get one more 15-minute chunk. So the title of my contribution to this very important book is The Effects of Modern Monetary Theory on the Structure of Production. And one of the things that I want to argue is I want to build on this Murray Rothbard point, a controversial point even among Austrian scholars, is that all government spending is wasteful consumption. And it basically does not affect the structure of production, at least the private sector economy. And this is because the government can't run itself like a business. Government doesn't buy factors of production, produce things, and then sell them for revenue in the future. So I want to focus on a part of my paper that I think actually has a lot of relevance for today. In this, again, it builds on what something Murray Rothbard discussed, which is that if government spending is wasteful consumption, then when we are trying to come up with some sort of aggregate statistic to measure overall production, right, something like gross domestic product, then government spending should basically be eliminated, right? This is more or less what Rothbard argued when he was advocating private product remaining. Now, as an Austrian and talking about aggregate statistics, of course, we're not talking about it from the perspective of economic theory. Murray Rothbard knew that and knew the pitfalls of something like gross domestic product. This is purely for economic history to have some sort of, I guess you could say, crude measure of how the output of an economy is doing. So Rothbard advocated private product remaining. And we actually are seeing now that at least it's being discussed by some pretty influential people over the past month. Elon Musk, who I mentioned earlier, had famously said that GDP should exclude government spending, right? And you even have Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who seemed interested in the idea. Now, the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the Department of Commerce, they are the ones that actually produce the GDP statistics. So, of course, like this is like shocking people. This is a big no-no. The deep state's very upset. Macroeconomists are saying, no, you can't do that. Government provides all sorts of valuable services, X, Y, and Z. This is partisan, blah, 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 blah. You're reducing trust in the statistics. And I'm like, well, reducing economists' trust in the statistics, or maybe like improving the public's confidence in the statistics. Those are not mutually incompatible. So I want to talk a bit about how the G got in GDP, right? How government spending got in gross domestic product, because it was actually quite controversial, right? And this is something that has relevance for modern monetary theory, because while modern monetary theorists, they criticize national output statistics, it's on the grounds that it doesn't really measure government spending enough, right? It ignores environmental pollution, income inequality and other problems. And of course, that's like the open sesame for more government intervention, the government to spend money on all sorts of stuff. But of course, if we realize that government spending is anti-productive, and this was something that a lot of some economists and fairly prominent economists had held back in the day, then this actually, someone could justify taking government spending out of GDP, right? It's not just crankish libertarianism, which is how some people might incorrectly, in my opinion, assume Rothbard's argument to be. None other than Simon Kuznets, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1971 for his work on measuring economic growth, and who's really the pioneer in GDP, right? He's the guy who more or less created the statistics that became GDP, as I'm going to explain. He envisioned government spending counting for a smaller share of total output than what the Department of Commerce decided on, right? In Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State, he actually alludes to this debate. He briefly talks about Kuznets, and it's something I wish he explored more, he built more upon, he elaborated upon, but it's actually quite an interesting back and forth. So what happened was in 1934, Kuznets, he was a scholar at the private National Bureau of Economic Research. He produced macroeconomic statistics for the Department of Commerce to sort of summarize the decline in GDP, summarize the decline in economic activity during the 1930s, all right? And he constructed a series he called National Income to try to measure production that was geared towards people's well-being. And he measured production with market value, right? Price times quantity, right? If people are willing to spend a higher price on something, that means they value something more, right? If businesses' revenue is greater than their costs, that means they were adding market value. If their revenue is less than their costs, that means they are, they're not adding market value. They're taking away from it. So in his first writings on this, Kuznets wrote that government was different. And quote, there may even be some doubt as to the propriety of classifying government as a branch of the country's economic system. Sounds Austrian. First and foremost, according to Kuznets, was that, quote, the motive of immediate profit, which characterizes private industry, is conspicuously absent from the activity of the government. Okay. Then there's the related problem that while the, quote, charges for the services rendered by industry to consumers are established on a comparatively free market, the charges by the government to business units and to individuals are not established on the free market, since the government has the right to and does tax, not in accordance with services rendered, but in accordance with ability to pay. So again, it sounds like Rothbard. Government's not run on profit and loss, and government gets its money through a coercive source of revenue, taxes, right? Unfortunately, Kuznets decided to measure government's contribution according to the payments it makes to employees because services like the post office are, quote, of real value and cannot, quote, be left to the operation of the free market forces, right? You're like, okay, that's not great. That's obviously, we would disagree with it. Austrians would disagree with it, but it certainly is like he's recognizing there are some issues with how to measure government spending, right? Of course, the Austrian response would be just because the government is producing services like the post office doesn't mean that the free market couldn't do the same, right? Or couldn't even do it better. So, all right, fast forward about a decade later. In 1941, Kuznets produced new national income statistics for the NBER from 1919 to 1938. And he changed how government spending or how government's contribution was measured. He said there are two approaches to measuring how we measure the productive output of government: the cost principle, which is how much the government spends, and the payment price principle, which is how much revenue the government earns. This is a great quote. Quote, the choice between the two principles is largely between two evils, for neither is adequate. Okay. He used the cost principle earlier on in his 1934 study, but now he realizes there's a serious issue with this. And he realizes the fact that, well, the government could sustain large deficits, right? Which is what had happened during the New Deal in peacetime for really the first time, you could say, in American history. So Kuznets thought that this extra spending should be excluded because the piling up of deficits during depressions, which allows the market value of governmental services to fall below the cost value, may be interpreted as reflecting a lower current valuation placed by society on governmental services. Basically, if the government is continuing to borrow more than how society values its services, which he's measuring according to tax revenue, this means that it's actually it's being inefficient. Right, which is not great. Austrians, as Rothbard pointed out, wouldn't say tax revenue measures our willingness to pay for government services, but it's at least sort of a step in the right direction, right? But Kuznets said the alternative, the payment price principle, was faulty again for the exact same reasons he mentioned before. Government's not run according to profit and loss, and the revenue is coercive tax payments. Government production is, quote, hardly characterized by the same spirit of calculation and economic rationality that prevails in private markets. That sounds a lot like the Austrians' economic calculation strictures, you could say, right? He ended up deciding, okay, we're going to use the payment price principle. We're going to measure government's contribution according to tax revenue because the deficit issue is too big of a problem. Okay, now where does the story get juicy? Fast forward to World War II, right? This study came out in 1941, so later in the year, basically the United States enters the war, and the Department of Commerce issues a new measure of aggregate output. And it was explicitly on the grounds that they believed that the national income statistics Kuznets was measuring would show that war mobilization would place too high of a burden on the economy. These are what's known as gross national product figures, which for the purposes of this presentation, I can say are equivalent to gross domestic product. These first figures came out in like January 1942. Now, who came out with this? Well, who was in charge of what became the Bureau of Economic Analysis? It was a guy named Milton Gilbert. He was a student of Kuznets, and he was a former speechwriter for Roosevelt, right? He was responsible for the statistics. He admitted that there are theoretical issues concerning the meaning of national income, but we got a problem of more practical interest, he said, which is how do we analyze the effect of military expenditures on the economy? Gilbert was close friends with his cousin Richard, who was a staunch Keynesian, and it was a director of the Defense Economics section of the Office of Price Administration and Civilian Supply. And Richard was having trouble getting the government to approve mobilization funds because it was seen as imposing too high of a burden. So basically, Richard was able to tell Milton, like, you need to come up with a new statistic that shows the burden of war mobilization is going to be smaller than we expect. And all you have to do is just add more government spending in the denominator, right? So it looks like war mobilization is going to impose a smaller burden. So Kuznets accepted the change, and he kind of had to because it was, wartime, and you couldn't criticize how the government was doing things. And he said, well, winning a war for national survival is so important that we have to do this, right? We have to measure government spending according to how much we have to measure government output according to how much the government spends, right? Now, what's funny is he said, Kuznets said that, quote, the implicit assumption of government outlay as an independent variable that can be modified directly by public policy means that it is then conceived to be of telling effect on national product as a dependent variable. Now, what that means is he's bringing up the familiar critique of Austrians and other free market economists that if the government spends more, well, then GDP is automatically going to go up, right? And he's recognizing this, right? In some historians' words, Kuznets expressed cynicism towards the Department of Commerce method. He argued that Commerce's method tautologically ensured that fiscal spending would increase measured economic growth, regardless of whether it actually benefited individuals' economic welfare. All right, so at the end of the war, Kuznets thought maybe we'd go back to doing, like the government would use the method I had done before, but then the Department of Commerce just said, no, we're going to continue to measure government spending, I keep saying this, government output this way. Kuznets got very upset at this. He said that the department's classification could be taken to imply that, quote, the government is somehow conceived as an ultimate consumer itself. Given a corporeal entity, the satisfaction of whose needs is raised to the same status of finality as the satisfaction of the needs of the men and women who comprise the community. Such interpretation represents fetishism. I've heard of a lot of fetishes in my life, but this is definitely, this one takes the cake, I guess, regarding government spending, but with dangerous implications that should be obvious. For one, Kuznets said, quote, the huge amount of resources employed under government auspices in the tremendous visible flow of tangible commodities, like we see all the stuff they're producing, may be quite limited and, in relation to the services rendered to consumers, right? Like what's the value? And then what matters, according to Kuznets, quote, is that of product, of the end result of the activity, not of the volume of activity itself. So you have the guy who basically created what became GDP, more or less saying a lot of the things that Rothbard had said, that government spending is you can't measure it like a business. There are issues with how you measure it. You just can't say it's how much according to how much the government spends. That's how productive its output is, and so on. And he was sort of grappling towards like a weaker version of private product remaining, right? At least just counting government's contribution according to the amount of revenue the government makes, right? The amount of tax revenue the government brings in. And I think that's very important, and it's relevant to modern monetary theory and into today, because it's not just crankish, free market economists who say that there are issues with how GDP measures government spending. Is literally the guy who came up with the statistics, right? And this is important for people to know, because otherwise we just say that, well, if you're taking government spending out of GDP, you're reducing the accuracy of the statistic. And no, it's actually the opposite. Like you're improving the accuracy of the statistics. So I think with that, I will conclude, and thank you so much.
All right, so my topic is job guarantees and the theory of idleness. The idea of a job guarantee has come up before already, in that it's kind of unusual in that when you look at MMTers, they come from lots of different backgrounds. Right? They kind of agree on the core of MMT theory, but in terms of policy, they will often go different directions, reflecting their different backgrounds. The exception to that is the job guarantee, which they basically all agree to, right? Which suggests there's something in MMT that implies, right, that a job guarantee is a good idea. So if you accept the theoretical construct, then this is a natural policy outcome. So I first want to make that case. Right? So this idea of MMT, one of the things that it suggests, and I think the quote, finding the money is the easy part, right, is absolutely true. Right? And that MMT suggests that the way that a monetary sovereign covers government spending is always the same, and that's money creation. Sometimes we offset this with taxation later in the process, right? But it's always money creation. How do we find the money? How do we pay for it? We create the money to do it, right? So that's not really what matters. Instead, what matters is the use of the real resources. Are we trying to achieve social goals using our real resources? Right? So those real resource constraints do still matter. Right? Now, the question is, what happens if we have a resource that, if it was unused, just vanished? So when I have eggs in my fridge, if I don't eat them today, they are there tomorrow and the day after. If I don't work 8 hours today, I can't then work an additional 8 hours tomorrow to make up for that. That labor is gone. And that is the philosophy that MMT brings to labor and how it works, is that if we don't use it today, it is gone. So we need to make sure that we maximize the available real resources by always using the labor that is potentially available to us. So what do we need to do? All these unemployed people are a serious problem. That's wasted resources. Let's make sure they're employed doing something, because doing something is better than doing nothing. And it doesn't really much matter what that something is. Right? Anything is better than nothing. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Most of my presentation here is based on Randy Wray's presentation of government as an employer of last resort. And it's interesting reading his paper. This was from 1997, in that when he talks about unemployment compensation, he sounds like the grumpiest conservative. Right? We're paying all these people to sit around and do nothing. He's very upset, right, at this idea we're paying people to be idle. Right? So what he's really concerned with, now this is going to make the analysis harder for me, is that they talk about income redistribution not at all, or if at all, very, very little. It's always about unemployment and idle resources. So in that paper, I searched for idle or idleness. That specific form showed up 3 times. I looked for unemployed. It shows up 104 times in a 50-page paper. So he's very concerned about unemployment, unemployed resources. I looked for redistribution. He only uses the word once, and it's not about income. What he's worried about is that we're going to redistribute government jobs out of current programs into the employer of last resort job guarantee program. That's his only use of redistribution. Now, there's a later paper in 2018 where it was Randy Wray and a couple other significant co-authors, like Stephanie Kelton was one of those, and a very similar pattern. Right? In their paper, they talk about unemployment, unemployed 82 times. They talk about redistribution or the distribution of income twice. Okay? So, which is interesting because my objections are all going to be based on the redistribution of resources. Right? So you had to realize that's actually what's happening, and they're not talking about it, and I suspect it's because that's not their concern. Their concern is this unemployment problem. We have these resources that are idle and therefore vanishing, and that's a problem. So what do we do about it? Job guarantee, also the employer of last resort policy. One of the significant disagreements is what the name should be. We really disagree about substance here. No, job guarantee is the better name, according to, I think it's Bill Mosler suggested that. So going back to Randy Wray's idea back in 1997, he suggested the government offers a job to anybody who is willing and able to work. $6.25 an hour was the wage at the time. So it was not far from the minimum wage. It was a little bit above that, what was considered a living wage at that point in time. If we inflation adjust that to today, that'd be $12.50 an hour. Interestingly, when you look at the more recent papers, that 2018 paper that I mentioned, they actually suggest $15 an hour plus healthcare benefits, right? Which we're finding some interesting points of agreement that we don't think that CPI is a good measure of price inflation. So there we are. This is the program. So anybody who wants to can come get this job. Basic public sector employment is the term used at this basic public sector wage. But all of this just assumes that labor is idle for no reason. Right? It's just senseless that this would happen. Right? So what we really need is an explanation of why is labor idle in the first place. Right? After all, if it is total waste, we don't like waste. Right? So we'd want to make use of this. And here William Hutt provides the answer for us when he was answering John Maynard Keynes back in the 1930s. Right? And he suggests 7 different reasons that we'd see idle resources in the economy. Now, I'm only going to talk about the first 4, because Hutt himself suggests that the last 3 have to overlap with the first 4 to really fit as ending up with idle resources. So I'll focus on the first 4. The first case being valueless resources. Right, so a valueless resource is one, by Hutt's definition, where even if it was free, we still would not use it. Right, so in this case, he often has in mind, say we have natural resources that are very difficult to get to, and we just don't have the capital structure available to actually extract these resources. I think of the natural resources on the moon. Right? They exist, right, but they're valueless to us because it would be pointless for us to try to put in all the resources necessary to exploit those particular resources. Now, he does talk about this in relation to labor and suggests that valueless labor basically doesn't exist. Right? Like virtually anybody has something of value they could do. So if you're going to volunteer to work for me at no pay, I can find something for you to do. My yard needs cleaned up. Right? That's fine, right? The only exception being the case of extreme disability. So somebody that doesn't actually have the physical or mental capacity to do something of positive value. Interestingly, so then what about this employer of last resort, a job guarantee for these people, this small handful of people that are idle because of extreme disability? Right? Would a job guarantee help them be less idle? The answer is no, and Randy Ray is actually explicit about this. He says, no, this would not apply for those that are not able to work. We'd still have to have some kind of disability insurance structure to make sure they're supported. But no, the job guarantee is not going to touch this case. All right, so our solution is not actually touching the first reason we'd have idleness. The second reason for idleness is pseudo-idleness, which I found easiest to understand by thinking about the idleness of my car when it's in the garage. It's not currently being used, right? But nonetheless, it is valuable. I'm not selling it. I'm not scrapping it, right? Because it's valuable based on expectations of future value, right? That it will have some use in the future. So how does this apply to labor? Because reading the chapter and how does this work for labor? Fortunately, he gives us a chapter about how it works for labor. And that is, he has 2 examples, one being the idleness of education, right? So we have people that are developing skills. Those skills are not yet valuable enough to really be marketable, but they're in the process of developing future skills that will be marketable, right? So these people may have a difficult time finding work. And that is, in fact, perfectly appropriate because what we want them to do is develop those skills, right? So that in the future, they will actually have a production that they can provide to society. Right? The other case would be the idleness of the day laborer who's waiting for a job. Right? So kind of imagine, right, have to go back a few decades in most places to find this, where the way that some parts of the labor market work is people show up to the town square, right, and wait for, say, the construction company to show up, the farmer to show up, say, oh, I need so many people to go and harvest my field, plant my field. I need so many people to build this barn, that type of thing. So all that time that the laborers are sitting in the town square waiting for a job to show up would be considered pseudo-idleness. Right? So you aren't currently being paid, you're not currently working. Nonetheless, you are providing value in that you're going to be available for work when it appears. Interestingly, we do see the same phenomenon appear in cases where we would not consider it to be idleness. I think about, say, the idleness of the secretary, right? Somebody who's paid simply to answer phones, right? A lot of the time you're being paid and employed and therefore not considered idle, according to MMTers, you're not actually actively doing much. You're waiting for the phone to ring. And it's very similar here in that what you're paid for is that availability. So what Hutt explains is that for the day laborer, what happens is during those times you are actually working, you're going to have a significantly higher wage that compensates you then not just for the time periods of active work, but also for the time periods of availability. Now, this is made more obvious with a secretary who's paid for 40 hours a week, whether she's answering phones or not, or he's answering phones or not, as the case may be. Right? So both of these cases, it's pseudo-idleness, and this would not be considered a problem. In fact, it's very valuable, right, to the economy to have pseudo-idleness there because we need to have people available when work shows up. Right? Right? And another point about this is that these day laborers have made the decision, right, not to take the secretary kind of structure. Right? We could have regular pay and just sit on the farm waiting for them to tell us to go harvest the field or what have you. But the agreement seems to be between the employers and the employees that's not the best way to deal with this. Instead, what we'll do is have periods where you're paid quite a bit for doing the physical work, and then periods where you're not paid but maintain availability. So what about job guarantees? Would that help these pseudo-idle types? Right? Would they actually participate? I suggest the answer is probably not, right? Unless, right, that basic public sector wage is high enough, right? It would have to be substantially high to say, okay, I'm going to give up the really high wage I can get when I take the job when the farmer shows up wanting me to harvest their field or what have you. Right, so it would have to be quite an expensive program if we're going to do this and convince these workers to give up their pseudo-idleness. The third category of preferred idleness, I think, is probably fairly obvious in the case of labor. That is, I don't want to work all the time. There are times that I would rather have leisure than whatever available job offers are available for me at that point in time. I think this is the case where job guarantees are going to have the biggest impact. So we're providing a new opportunity that did not previously exist. It's going to be attractive to some people, whether it's the traits of the job, the pay that's available, the schedule that's available, something about it is going to attract some people out of idleness into the job guarantee program. But here we need to note, they're not going from producing nothing of value to producing something of value. They're going from producing leisure that they find valuable to something that might possibly be valuable depending on the program they get assigned to. The last case is participating idleness. This would be a case, in the case of labor, this shows up with labor unions having short-time agreements with work sharing. This is exactly what was described by HUD. So the idea is that suppose there's a decrease in production at your employer. Right? Now they could lay off, say we're going to lay off a quarter of the people. The short-time agreement says, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, everybody is going to work 30 hours a week instead of 40. Right? So we'll share this burden, this decrease in work. Now, in order to continue to get the benefit of those 30 hours a week, you have to maintain employment with the employer for that to be the case, which means now you have this partial idleness, this 10 hours you were previously working, now you're not. Would this get touched, right, by a job guarantee program? I suspect the answer is no. Right? As long as you found this to be attractive as part of the employment process, you're not going to hop into the job guarantee program instead. Right? So the first point about the job guarantee program is that it feels like it's limited in scope, specifically primarily for those that had preferred idleness to start with. Right? So I think that's one point to make. All right. Another point to think about when we think about job guarantees is what the alternative is. And I think that Randy Wray really tries to make it attractive by talking about how terrible unemployment compensation is, and that's basically the other option. So I want to first compare, right, to government unemployment insurance and say, well, what is it here? Now, in principle, we could say a job guarantee could be better, right, depending on that difference in the cost of the program and the value of the output versus, right, the cost of the unemployment program. And this starts to feel tempting until we think about what those costs actually are going to be. Right? So I want to just share a few facts about government unemployment insurance as it currently exists. One is that currently in the US, we have about 7 million people that qualify as being unemployed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition. Only about 1/3 of those receive unemployment compensation. So about 2/3 of people are technically considered unemployed, that is, willing, available to work, but currently don't have work. Right? Only 1/3 of them are taking the unemployment benefits. So it's not nearly as expensive a program as Randy Wray would have us believe. Right? So that's one point. Another is that while we may not love unemployment insurance, it does have a couple benefits in that, one, it's limited in scope. It's only 1/3 of people taking it, and you have to qualify for it. Not just anybody can sign up for unemployment insurance because you don't have a job. There's qualifications required. And it's also limited in time. Right? So eventually you run out of benefits, which is part of the reason that we don't have everybody without a job part of this program. Right? So it is limited there. Right? But then we want to think about what happens with the job guarantee. Okay? You can be on it forever, but that's not the only cost. Right? There are other resources that have to go into employment. If I'm just sitting around collecting unemployment, okay, yeah, it's a waste, but on the other hand, it's only wasting my time, right? But if I'm trying to employ people to do something else, say, I don't know, painting murals downtown or something like that, they need to have paint, they need to have paintbrushes. So we have other resources that have to get reallocated. So we have two types of redistribution that are going to happen with a job guarantee program. Right? One is the redistribution of consumption goods, as we have people that have this income that wouldn't previously had it. And we have Cantillon effects working here as well, as it's new money being created to be handed to the people that are working the job guarantee program, reallocating resources toward those people. But the other would be the reallocation of this complementary capital goods that they need in order to do the job guarantee jobs. Right? So we'll see a movement away from the various private sector employments and those use of resources, which are disciplined by profit and loss, into the public sector, which is not so disciplined by profit and loss, as Patrick was just talking about. Right? So we have this movement of resources from where we have at least some test of productivity and some reason for us to be productive, incentive to productivity. And as Mises points out, profit itself reallocates resources toward those that are more productive and using resources well, moving out of that system into a system where we don't have any such discipline. So it's going to eat away at the private sector. And I think we see this. One of the, most real job guarantee suggestions recently has been in the Green New Deal. One of the early versions of it included a job guarantee program. They very quickly got that out of it, because people got suspicious. And I suspect it's because they knew many elements of that program would be harmful to the private sector. And the public sector stood ready to take over those resources. Thank you.